start on today's topic. So from here on, for the most part, I'm going to kind of demonstrate how to do certain things. And here is an app that I have written recently. And let me show you what the app does up to this point, and then I'll show you how it is done. My emulator should be up and running. Yep. Okay. And I can now upload the application. So let me go ahead and download the application first. And then I'll upload it, and then I'll show you what it does up to this point. And how much work is actually involved to even get to this point, okay? Because a lot of things that we assume the computer should be able to do, it does not exist, okay? You actually have to write code to do, things that we think is kind of minor, and the computer should be able to do it. So I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that when we get to that. All right, saving it to, it's called Game Timer Apk. You probably can imagine what it is for. Okay, it's for my kids to kind of time their game time, so they can have a little timer to start and then stop, to keep track of how much time they spend, playing video games. So
would that be on the honor system?
Well, at this point it's an honor system, but later on, I can attach other things to the app. So I'll go ahead and install it first. Go. Alright, so now it's installed in my emulator, and we'll go ahead and take a look. It's called Game Timer, and that's it. I mean, look at the user interface. It's really simple. It has two text boxes. It's on one right now to enter how much time is allocated per day for gaming, and it has another one to allocate how much time for each session, because my kids like to break up their game time into multiple sessions. So with each session they can set up a different time. There's a remaining, which is only a label. This is just a label of how much time is remaining for that particular day, and this is how much time is remaining for that particular session. The reset button doesn't do a single thing right now. I have this is something that I have yet to do. And if I press the start button, that's all it's going to do is it's counting down the time and just decrementing the timer. Or there are two timers, and I can press the stop button. It stops. If I press the reset button, I take it back. It does reset the session time, but it doesn't reset the daily time. So they can basically say, okay, I want to use more time for my current session, or they can abandon a particular session later on and say, okay, I want to start a new session. But it doesn't change the daily time. The daily remaining time is always continuing to count down, and it doesn't reset by itself. Okay, so this is the current state of the app. So we'll take a look at all the fun stuff that has to go on behind the scenes in order to get the time to display even. Okay. Are there any questions about the interface itself right now? Any questions about no? Okay. So let's take a look at what is actually behind this, what is actually happening behind the scenes in order to make this app just to do what it is doing at this point. Oh, there's one feature that is not easily demonstrated because it's not on the screen itself. So let's say the person who's using this app accidentally pressed the back button, or for whatever reason close the app. So the app is now closed. Okay. When the app is restarting, this is what it gets. The time is resumed. Okay, if you look at the remaining time, everything, all of these 4 times are actually a continuation from where the app left off. In other words, someone can start it and close the app. When the app is reopened, it kept the time. Okay, which I think is a very important feature. I should probably have a warning. You're about to close the application. And keep the timer running in the background, just so that it doesn't stop the timer right away. Okay, so let's take a look at what is happening behind the scenes, just so that we know how much code is needed just to get this much done. One of the functions or procedures that I always implement in almost every single app that I do is called, something like, set default if missing or something along that line. What it does is it handles a list of pairs. Okay, it handles a list of pairs. It allows someone to set a default value for a particular tag, and this is a flag, which is either true or false, to force that particular tag value to be overwritten. In other words, if overwrite is false, then it will only add a new tag to the default value if it is missing from the list to begin with. If overwrite is false and a tag does exist in the list of pairs, then nothing is done. It simply says, oh, okay, you have a value already, there's a tag already, I'm not going to do anything. On the other hand, if overwrite is true, then it will always overwrite the value of that tag. If it doesn't exist, it will create it. If it already exists, it will overwrite its current value. Okay, so this particular procedure is really helpful because App Inventor has a feature that is doing the opposite, and that part is already done. If you look under lists and scroll all the way to the bottom here, it already has a feature called lookup in pairs. Okay, what it does is you can specify a list of pairs, with the second parameter, pairs. You can specify a tag, which is the key. You can specify a value to return when that particular key is not found. Okay, so that part is already done, but it's only good for looking up something. It is not good for setting a particular value for a tag in the list of pairs. And that's why I write my own subroutine to do the other part, which is to add items inside a list of pairs and also overwrite if I want to just overwrite the value of one of the tags that is already in the list of pairs. And I personally found this to be really useful in just about every app that I write because I use list of pairs for just about everything. Are there any questions about this particular procedure, what it is supposed to do at this point? Not how it's doing it, just what it is supposed to do. Okay, so this is the outer block, which is the definition of a procedure. And you should know what a procedure or a subroutine is at this point, even if you're taking cisp362 in the same semester, because I'm almost done teaching subroutines in my P300 class. Okay, so in this case it has 4 parameters. Basically you can pass 4 pieces of information to the subroutine. The first one is a list of pairs. The second one is just a name, which is quote unquote the key. Okay. The third one is a default value to that particular key. And then the last one is a flag. And the flag does one thing. As I said, this flag is basically just saying, am I going to overwrite the value? Okay, those are the 4 parameters to the procedure. This block here, I'm just highlighting the block in the inside, is a block that allows you to create local variables within that block. A local variable, for those of you who do not have not or need a refresher of what a local variable is the variable in this case. The variables, there are 2. One is called found and the other one is called I. Both of these are local variables, which means they are visible only within this block. They are not visible from anywhere outside of this block. That's one sense of being local. The second sense of being local is they do not even exist until this subroutine is active and when it is invoked. Okay? And they are initialized. Found is initialized to a value of false, is a boolean, and I is initialized to 1, which is a number. And now we move into the while block here. A while block is a pre-checking loop. It checks a condition. If the condition is true, then it will go ahead and perform the block that is inside it. And then after that, it will go back and check the condition again. It will keep checking the condition and perform the block, check condition and perform the block until the condition is no longer true. When the condition is no longer true, then it will proceed with whatever block that is after the while block itself. So right here, you can see the condition to stay in the loop is expressed with this conjunction block here. And the word "and" in English is called conjunction in computer science and mathematics. What it does is it requires both sides to be true for the entire thing to be true. In other words, if at least one side is false, the entire thing is false. The first thing it checks is not found. Okay. In other words, if found as a variable is storing a value of true, I'm getting out of the loop because I've just located what I want to locate, so I don't need to get in. I don't need another iteration through the loop anymore. If not found is true, in other words, found itself is false, I will go check the second condition. I'm comparing I to the length of the list, which is the incoming list of pairs. I need to make sure that I is less than or equal to the length of the list, because in this case, in App Inventor, the indexing of inside the list goes from 1 to the number of items in the list, instead of 0 to the number of items in the list minus 1, which is more conventional with most other programming languages. But nonetheless, I just want to make sure that I is within the range of a valid index within the list, so I can look at another item in the list. Inside the loop here, I have another local variable block because I want to create a new local variable called pair just to store the current item that I'm looking at in the list. So I'm using this block here to select a particular item from the list, and using the position I to locate that particular item in the list to process what potentially can be a pair. A pair simply means it has a name for the first item and it has something else for the second item. That something else for the second item, I don't really care. It can be another name, can be a boolean, can be a value, the numeric value. It can be a list all on its own. I don't care. I just need to know, I just want to look at the first one, which is the name. So once I have the pair, which is an item from the list itself, the first thing I do is to use a if-then block to see if pair itself is a list. Because if it is not a list, I'm not going to do any further processing. There's no need to do any further processing. It's a singleton. If it is a list, then I'll go to the inner conditional statement. I want to check whether pair as a list has exactly 2 items, because if it has more items, I'm not going to process it. If it has only 1 item, I'm not going to process it. It has to have exactly 2 items. The first one being the key and the second one being the value, in order to continue into the third, another level of conditional statement. This one makes a fair assumption because it is assuming the first item of that list is a string that I can compare. Okay, so it is an assumption already that I'm not checking and see whether it's a string. But assuming it is a string, I'm taking the first item, using this block to extract the first item out of the list and say, let's compare that to the name that is given to me and see if they are the same. If they are in fact the same, then the first thing I would do is to identify and say, hey, I just found it. Okay, I just found the tag that I was asked to locate. Okay, and then what I will do is I will check whether the overwrite parameter is true or not. If overwrite is true, then I will go ahead and replace the second entry anyway with the new quote-unquote default value. If overwrite is false, then this entire block is skipped, which means I will just retain whatever is there. When I get out of the loop, which means I'm going to be here, okay? When I get out of the loop, I will check one thing. In other words, I'm going to check to see, did I find the tag inside this list of pairs? If I did not find it, which means not found is going to be true, then I'll do one thing, because what I'll do is, oh, I take it back, never mind. I take it back because this is actually still inside the loop here. If not found is true, I'm going to increment I so I can look at the next item. That's what it's doing. This is the part that is outside of the loop. In fact, zooming out a little bit may be helpful to see the context. Okay, or I can just simply collapse this block here, so that way the control flow is a little bit more clear and I can zoom back in and look at more detail. This is one cool thing about having an editor that can collapse a block, because you can basically hide detail that is no longer important to you at a certain point. So right now you can see very clearly that this block here, this conditional statement, it's outside or after the loop. And so after the loop, I'm checking, did I find the tag that I was asked to find? Okay, if I did not find it, if not found, the only thing left to do is to say, okay, since it did not exist, since it still doesn't exist, I'm going to create it. Okay, I'm creating a new item that is by itself a list, having the tag as the first item and the default value as the second item. Both of these are passed to me by, as parameters, and I'm adding that to the end of the list that is also given to me, and that's it. Okay, this is the entire procedure that is serving as basically the opposite of the built-in block called lookup in pairs, because instead of just looking it up, this is actually putting an entry into the list of pairs. Are there any questions about this particular procedure?
Question. How did you collapse the block?
You right click and then you say collapse block, which I just did with the other block.
And which block did it collapse this time?
Whichever one that is highlighted.
So that one there. Okay.
So this one is already collapsed. I can right click and say expand block, and now it is expanded, in its full glory.
Is that available in 1.0?
I believe so.
Okay.
I have not used 1.0 for a long time, so I cannot say for sure. But it's a really useful feature because you can choose which block to collapse to, so you can hide the details that is no longer important to you at a certain point. Are there any questions about this, this particular procedure?
Can I ask about this kind of procedure?
Go ahead.
If someone uses an app for the first time and it loads the database, the tiny database,
Yes.
and then he uses it again a week later, does it reload everything? Or does it set a
Only
flag?
if your app does that.
Can you set a flag that says, this was done a week ago, I don't have to do it again? Can that be done?
Okay, can you be more specific about what was done a week ago?
Suppose I have, what I want to do is this. Suppose I have some graphics in the media panel.
Okay.
And that's external reference or something else.
Okay.
Okay. And that external reference sometimes fails. I get a message from the troubleshooting group. But I won't get that message if I can store those references, or no, store the actual data in TinyDB.
Okay, when you refer to data, are you referring to the path to the image, or are you referring to the image itself?
When you use a graphic, you'll get listed in the media panel such and such GIF file. It'll be listed there. Then when it's referenced in the block editor, they go out and find it where it's stored, either on the internet or on my flash drive or on my hard drive.
Okay.
Okay. Well, sometimes the system fails to read the flash drive, and I can avoid that if I can actually store the graphic in TinyDB.
That I think may not be possible to store an entire bitmap in TinyDB. TinyDB is intended for small items, but not, as far as I understand, cannot store an entire bitmap.
Well, I can try it if it has the capacity of your available computer space.
Yes, that it has, but whether it can actually store something like that, because there's no image type in App Inventor to store in your TinyDB. Do you understand?
Can I store the file name there?
You can store a file name, that's fine. A file name is a string, and therefore
Yes.
you can definitely store that. Yeah.
And that's all that listing in the panel references that file name. And it can be on the internet, it can be on your hard drive, etc.
Well, as long as the image component can handle that string that specifies where to find the image, then it will be okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Then that's the original question. When the person reuses it, will it load information a second time?
Your app has to do it.
Okay. Can your app define a variable that you will turn on to true the first time it's loaded?
You
by
can
this
see
user?
if a tag is already in TinyDB. That you can do.
You define the tag.
Huh?
Not the tag. You define the yes or no flag as a variable. Okay. Can one set that the first time this user uses that app, so that the next time the user uses that app, it can query that flag to see it. This has already been done. Can you do that?
Okay. I'll show you what TinyDB can do, and it's okay. This is what TinyDB can do. So you have what you're describing. You have to do it. Using one of these blocks. I know which one you have to use already, but you kind of have to make that decision too. I mean, that's part of what you're learning in this class.
All I'm doing is loading up TinyDB with some tags and data.
Yes.
Okay.
But the first time there won't be anything to load.
No, but the first time the flag will show there's nothing there and you will load it.
No, there's nothing to load. Your TinyDB is empty. So when your TinyDB is empty and you're trying to get a value, oh, I just clicked the block. Okay. You are going to use.
You can test whether it's empty.
You can test it. Yes, you
Yes.
can. So
Well,
this
perhaps-
is the block that you have to use, and then you have to figure out how to test it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But this would mean that you would be defining that tag for this one particular user.
Yes. Well, no, you're defining the tag for the entire application.
That's right. So you can't define a tag for just one particular user. So
Okay,
this
but-
guy had already used the app one time before.
But what do you mean when you say a user? What constitutes a user?
Me, I want to use the app. The first time I use it,
Are you the only?
initialized
Are you
routine.
only expecting one user on that particular device? Then it's not. Then it's easy. You just check whether a tag exists or not.
We create this app, and there's a whole lot of people out there who might want to use it.
They are all independent.
Yeah, they are. That's the point. So this means that you can't define a flag to indicate what one particular user has done and the others have not done. That can't be done.
If you want to link multiple users,
No, I don't want to
then,
link anybody.
huh?
They're not linked. They're just separate people using the app. There's no link.
Okay, but
what to
one.
avoid is just one John Doe shouldn't have to load all the data into the tiny database next time he uses the app. Is that possible to detect? That this John Doe has already
I
used it
suggest
one
that you
time?
read the documentation on TinyDB and see if you think that will serve your purpose.
Okay.
We
well,
talked about that already quite a few times in this class, so you might need to just kind of review what we have talked about.
Okay.
Okay. So any other questions? Any other questions other than that? No other questions? Okay. So I want to show you how this particular app remembers all the time settings, how much time is remaining and stuff like that. So I want to show you just that code. Okay. This is the initialization of screen 1. It does certain things like defaulting the stop button to green and to make it to display the start, the word start. What is interesting is about this block here. The entire application only has one global variable that is actually quote unquote a variable. All of the other ones are basically just string constants that I create, and I can explain that later too. But there's one single global variable called lp_config or list pair config. And this one single thing is a list of pairs, and it stores the configuration of the entire application. It's a single object, but it stores everything that is related to the application. When the application starts, I'm going to ask TinyDB and say, hey, give me back my configuration. Okay, you load the configuration. If it does not have the configuration already stored in TinyDB, then it's going to return false. So the next thing I do after I attempt to load the configuration for this particular application is to ask, hey, did I get a list into lpconfig? Because if I get anything other than a list into lpconfig, I know lpconfig is not done correctly. So I should reinitialize everything. So in that case, I will create an empty list for lpconfig and just say, okay, let's start from scratch, because I did not load anything that is usable to me as the configuration of this application. And then after that, I call the procedure that I just described a little bit earlier and basically say, okay, let's take a look at lpconfig here and see if I can find my daily allowance, my daily amount. This is saying, the false is saying if it is missing, go ahead and initialize it and create that item and make it 3.6 million. And this is measured in milliseconds. Yep.
Can you skip that one if process and just, if the value tag's not there, just create a new list?
It cannot, no it cannot, because if accidentally, okay, if it is missing entirely, it is going to be set to false, which is a Boolean value.
Oh, yeah.
If I send a Boolean value into set default if missing, it's not going to work. So I have to make it an empty list in order to conform to the type that is expected by set default if missing.
Okay.
So that's the only reason why I have the conditional statement to say, okay, is it missing entirely or do I have something already? But that's a good question, because it would be nice if I could do that, but no. But that actually answers your question too, about starting up and see if there's a configuration already stored. So this is actually answer your question. You just have to kind of link what my app is doing to what you want to do with your app. So there are a few other things that I want to configure as well. So you can see there are other daily remaining time, session amount or session allocation, and also session remaining time. So all four of those numbers that you see on the app itself, they're all retained as as entries in a single list of pairs in the configuration. Now the reason why I make this a single list of pairs instead of what most people would do is to create 4 global variables and then store 4 individual items into TinyDB. The reason why I make it into a single one is really simple. When I go to backpressed here, the only one thing I need to do to store the existing state of the application is to store lpconfig. That's the only thing I have to store, because everything is maintained in the list of pair as a single item. So if I want to save the configuration of the entire application, there's only one thing for me to save. I don't have to remember to save a gazillion items. As I add more entries, more things that I have to track, I'm going to add all of those into the lpconfig list of pairs. So in the end, I always only have one single global variable that I actually have to save. Yep.
What if the person presses the home button and the application is not closed, then just closes the task?
Then it will not save the information. In order to prevent that from happening, or in order to kind of make sure that it still saves the information even when you forcibly close the application, I will have to save it for every second. So every time I update the screen, I will have to do a TinyDB store, which is probably not a good idea, because that may wear out the flash prematurely. So that's why I don't plan to do that. So maybe I can have the timer to basically say every minute or every 2 minutes, I can store something into TinyDB, which is already a whole lot better, because now I'm only writing, once every 120 seconds instead of every second. Yep.
You could make it do it on a close event, though?
When you close an application forcibly, I don't think you get any event. Let me double check. So are you talking about in...
yeah, I'm not talking about in test, I'm just talking about that. Where you're closing the activity or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think you get a notification. Sorry?
Just putting it into the background.
Well, that's just closing the background process.
Yeah, I don't think you get an event, when you do that. You can close your app, voluntarily, but if you are closed forcibly, I don't think you get an event for that, because there's nothing here corresponding to getting closed from the outside. So the only thing you can do to kind of guard against that is to periodically, every minute, every 2 minutes or so, you just save everything.
Does this also include native Android applications? I would think that they will have a certain API for that.
Not necessarily, because in a native Unix process or Linux process, at least, I'm not sure about the Unix processes. In a native Linux process, there are two signals or two ways to kill an application of a process. One is just terminate, that can be detected, so the application can say, hold on a second here, I got something to do before I close. The other one is forcibly, which means the application doesn't have a say, it's done. There's no way to block it.
Yeah, that's the int test, but
Right.
The method I was showing may be different.
Right. So I think for Android, there has to be a way for the Android system, which is sitting on top of Linux, to forcibly kill an app or an activity without the activity having any way to intercept and say, no, I'm not ready yet. Because if an app is misbehaving in that part of the code, then you will never have a chance to actually terminate that particular activity.
Yeah, that's where the int test comes in.
Yep. All right, so let's go back to this app here. You can also see that when I press the reset button, I don't even specify any code inside the click event. Instead, I use a procedure to describe what I have to do. This gives me the flexibility of being able to trigger the same logic but from somewhere else. Okay, so it's always a good idea to turn your code into a subroutine first and then have the event handler to call the subroutine, because that always gives you the option of, hey, maybe I want to trigger the same operation as a part of another event handler. So it's always a good idea to write procedures to deal with that sort of thing. All right. So this is the actual content of resetting a session. You can see that it's a lot of stuff. Initializing stuff. These are all local variables. Basically, I'm just making sure that there's enough time within the daily remaining to replenish the session amount or the allocation for this particular session. Yep.
Is the multi-variable within that block a new feature to the latest update?
You mean local variables like these? I do not think so. I think it has always been able to handle multiple local variables.
I just don't remember seeing that gear there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was there. The mechanism is a little bit different. When you click this button here, it gives you, the screen is too small, so I have to keep scrolling around. You can create new ones if you want to. You can drag this block into here, then you can create new local variables. That has always been there in App Inventor 2. The concept of local variable is missing entirely in App Inventor 1.
Well, in App Inventor 1, that button wasn't there. It was a question mark, and you could actually just, instead of having to create something to view what that variable is doing, you
Right.
view what it's doing.
Right, but you cannot create new local variables, which is a big obstacle when you're writing subroutines, because if you cannot create local variables, then your only choice is to use global variables, which is not exactly a good idea.
How does it differentiate between global and local, or just by the name global?
Yes, in fact, when you click the drop-down box here, it will show you, all the names that are available within that scope. Let me pick a different place. Escape, because I don't want to change my program
Those
accidentally.
aren't static, right?
Sorry?
Those aren't static, right?
They are not static. You can actually do recursion. So when you click the drop-down box, in a get block, it will show you all the global variables, as options, but it will also show you the local variables and parameters that are visible within that scope, which I think is really helpful until you run out of space to display that list, which happened to me quite a few times.
Zoom out, zoom out.
Yep. The reason why I would run out of space is because I use a lot of quote-unquote global variables for string constants. If you look at these global variables, the only one that has anything to do with configuration is lp-config. That's the only one. But all of these other ones, str blah 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 blah, they're all string constants. Okay, and the reason why I use string constants is so that I can refer to the key or the tag consistently and not having to worry that I have a typo somewhere and therefore I'm accessing something different from what I intend.
Yeah, I do that with my list indexes as well.
So that's why you can see that my applications typically have let me locate all my global variables, which are all hidden under this block. And there are a few up here too. So you can see that string last start, which is the last start time that the app has to remember, is just a string of last start. But that is serving as a key or tag to the LP to the list of pairs. So when I need to specify the key or the tag, I only refer to these string constants that I have defined as global variables. I do not refer to the literal string last start, because if I did that and I have a little typo like uppercase, lowercase, and stuff like that, then it will mistakenly think that it's missing or has a different value, and I do not want that situation to happen. And that's why I end up with a lot of string constants, just for the purpose of excuse me, I take it back. That's why I have a lot of global variables, for the purposes of having string constants. Okay, any questions?
Question.
Yes.
You get a warning if you approach or exceed the list of characters for string constants, or does it just not work?
I have not I have not approached that limit yet. So
you said you almost did.
I run out of screen space to display the list.
Oh.
So you just choose a higher resolution, make your browser larger, or zoom out so you can look at the entire list. They should have made the list sensitive to the allocated area, so it will wrap around a few times.
Yeah,
give you a little
like
scroll
above
bar
or below the block.
Yeah, that would be nice. Maybe I should send a little request.
Or just being able to scroll through the list.
Yeah. Or being able to type. You can actually select global variables just by typing the name, but not local variables nor the parameters, which is a problem because the global variables are listed first, so I can usually pick one of those. It's the local ones that I cannot access, and yet I cannot type the name and get to them either. So there are certain things that they can still improve in terms of the user interface. Okay, let me show you something else. Okay, switch back to the app first, and I will show you here. Okay, look at the remaining, the time that is remaining. 00 hour, 58 minutes, and 15 seconds. Okay, this is the usual way that we, represent time, right? Hour, minute, second. Can anyone guess how Linux in general represent time internally?
Did we do this before? Did we go over this before?
I think so, maybe.
Milliseconds.
In milliseconds since 1970, January 1st, midnight. Okay, so that's a rather large number, don't you think? And it's not intuitive to us and say, this means afternoon, 2 p.m. this afternoon. There's no way I can do that translation manually. Maybe some people can, but I cannot. Okay, so we need some way to convert that time into the time that we understand here. Okay, so let's take a look at the code that does the conversion, because you would think that it's simple to do all that conversion, but it's not. I mean, it actually doesn't have that. This is my first attempt. I can actually delete it now because I don't need it anymore. this is my first attempt to convert an actual value into a double-digit decimal number. In other words, n can be, let's say, the value of 57. Okay, the value of 57 gets printed out as 57. Fine. Okay, what about the value of just 8? The value of 8 is printed as, okay, I'm giving you a choice here. Do you think 8 is printed as just regular 8, or do you think 8 is printed as 08 with a leading 0?
08.
Why?
I'm required two non-blank characters.
Just because you want it doesn't mean that you get it, right? Okay, we do want the 08 because when we represent time as second, for instance, we do want to print 08 because we want both digits. That's the convention. Okay, this is how we are used to things when we read time. But excuse me, when you set a label to the numeric value 8, it will only convert it to a single digit 8 instead of 08. Because there's no way the string conversion can automatically know, oh, I think you want one leading 0 here, or I want you to, I know that you want exactly 2 digits. How can the app know that you want exactly 2 digits instead of 4, instead of 8, instead of 3? There's no way, right? So that means in order to print something into a double-digit decimal number, even that, I need my own logic to do it. I have to use the quotient of n divided by 10 and also the remainder of n divided by 10 in order to get this done. Okay, so something that is really simple, just printing a number as a base 10 number, making sure that it's using 2 digits, has to be done manually. So you can see that I have another subroutine here that is given the number of milliseconds. Okay, you give me a number of milliseconds, and it will convert it into minute and seconds, separated by a single colon. That's the code to do it. I'm calling number to 00, which is over here, to get this part done. So ms2time is in return called by another subroutine when it's time to do the conversion. But when you look at the application, you will say, but Tech, where exactly did you use that subroutine? Because every single time that I can see here actually has the hour as well. I'm not just displaying the minute and the second, there's always the hour too. Well, this is when I realized that sometimes I let my kids to have more than 1 hour of game time, like over the weekend. I would give them like more than 1 hour of game time, and I would not be able to represent it correctly. I guess I can use like 120 minutes to represent 2 hours, but that's not how most people represent time. So that's when I realized and go like, oh, this approach is way too brittle. I mean, it doesn't work flexibly, and it's not the way I want it. Okay, so I actually wrote a new subroutine to do all that stuff. Let me find out where to, oh, right here. And I don't think I even used that one. I used it in something else. Number to text. Yep, that is the one. Okay, this is the first one. Okay, number to text is a general purpose subroutine. You give it n as a numeric value, like 470 or whatever. Okay, you give it the number of digits. Okay, it will always use this number of digits, and if the number does not require that number of digits, it will just use zeros to pad the most significant digits. And this one, I made it flexible enough to you can also specify the base. In other words, if you want to print something in base 8, you can just specify 8 as the base. It doesn't do hexadecimal numbers, by the way, because hexadecimal numbers require special consideration, because once you get through 0 to 9, then you have to move on to A, B, C, D, E, F, and this doesn't have the logic to do it. But anyway, you can deal with any other type of odd bases. Any base that is 10 or lower, you can do it. You can do base 2 conversion if you want to. So inside this one, result is the actual result that I want to pass back, and this is one of the procedures that returns a value, and that's why you see result here. And then this is a do result block, which means you have some action to perform in the do block here, and then you have to specify a single value as the result that is passed back to the code that is invoking this subroutine. So it is a subroutine that returns a value. And then inside here we have a kind of like a macro of a loop. In other words, it's not a loop that is absolutely required, but it is really it's a really nice feature. It's a shorthand. What it does is it will let number, which is a local variable, to go from 1 up to the second number here, which is in this case is the number of digits, and it will go by 1. In other words, if I specify 4 digits, it will be 1, 2, 3, 4. It will go through exactly 4 iterations. For each iteration, the first thing I do is to specify is to handle one more digit. To handle that one more digit, I'm going to join 2 parts into one single string. The second part is the string itself, whatever the string started off with, which already has the least significant digits. And the more significant digit is done by calculating the remainder of n divided by the base. After this step, I will change n to become the quotient of n divided by base, so that I can move on to the next digit, which is the more significant digit after the one that I just took care of. So this will basically, attach or append, not append, is going to specify 1 digit at a time for a particular number, so it becomes printable. Don't you think this one is a little bit more flexible than having exactly 2 digits? The one that I had before, number to 00. This one can handle like 4 digits, 3 digits, 1 digit, 2 digits, doesn't matter. You tell it how many digits, and it can even do base conversion along the way. So it's just a little bit more general, and and it becomes one of the few things that I had to do to display time. So this is one, and let's see whether this one is actually the one that I'm using, because I cannot remember. Yep, I think this is the other one that I'm using. Okay. So let me show you this procedure here. Zooming out just a little bit first. Okay, this procedure has a very funky name. The funky name is millisecond in number of milliseconds to a time format, which is based on hour, minute, second, and millisecond. In other words, I'm chopping the number of milliseconds, which is usually a pretty huge number, into 4 components. The 4 components would be the number of milliseconds, the number of seconds, the number of minutes, and the number of hours. That's how this one works. In the inside here, we have a local variable n, which is basically just keeping track of the number, the value that I'm dealing with at this point. And it's also dealing with result, but result in this case is a list. In other words, this subroutine doesn't give me a string already in the format of hour, minute, second, and millisecond. It's giving me a list in which the number of milliseconds is the first item, the number of seconds is the second item, the number of minutes is the third item, and the number of hours is the 4th item in the list. And here we have a do result block here. And the first thing I do is to look at the number of milliseconds. Okay? And that becomes the number, that becomes the millisecond divided by 1,000, but I only want the remainder of that, and that becomes the first item in the list. And then I modify n so it becomes just the number of seconds. That's why I'm keeping the quotient of millisecond divided by 1,000. The second item I add to the list is the number of seconds. Now how do I know the number of seconds? Well, it's just n, which is already in the number of seconds, divided by 60, but I only want the remainder because the quotient of that becomes the number of minutes, which is now handled by the 3rd block here, and then the number of hours is handled by the 4th block here. I did not use a loop here, even though I could have used a loop for the last 3 blocks because they look identical to me. I just decided not to use a loop in this case because each one handles a particular part of the time format that I need to use. So this one doesn't do any display, it doesn't convert anything to a string, it just breaks up the number of milliseconds into 4 components. Because this way I have the flexibility later on to decide, okay, but what am I going to do with these 4 components? Well, I can decide what to do with them later. I just do all the calculations here. Is that okay so far? Okay. To make use of this list, I have this subroutine here. Number to text. Nope, not this one. Where is the other one? This one here, millisecond to text. This one actually converts the number of milliseconds to a string that I can display as a label or as the text of a text box. So let's take a look at this one here. It is given only one parameter, which is ms, the number of milliseconds, which is a number, it's a numeric value. And then in this block here, the first thing it does is to say, hey, given the number of milliseconds, let's convert it into a list of the 4 items. Let's convert it into a list that will give me the number of milliseconds, the number of seconds, the number of minutes, and the number of hours as a list. And the result, which is going to be a string from this particular subroutine, is just initialized to an empty string at this point. This is the block that actually does anything does something useful. So what it does is, the first thing it does is to toss away the first item in the list of the 4 numbers, because I don't want to display the number of milliseconds. Okay, that is not important to me. I do not need to display that. So I toss away that item and just say, okay, let's not worry about the number of milliseconds. And then once I toss away the first item, I have 3 items left. Of the 3 items left, for each item within the 3 items that is left, I am going to do this block here. Okay, this block looks kind of complicated because it has a lot of kind of stuff in it. It's going to use a join operation to expand the string that I'm creating. The last part of the string is just result itself. In other words, I'm appending things ahead of what is already in the string. What I'm appending ahead of the string is potentially a colon. In other words, it's not always a colon. I only want a colon if the string already has something. If the string is initially empty, I don't need a colon to end a string. So I need a colon only if I already specify something, and I need that colon to separate the minute from the second, and also to separate the hour from the minute. So that's why this is a conditional block that returns a value, depending on whether the result itself is empty at the time or not. The first part is to call number to text. So this time I'm basically just saying, okay, let's take a look at item, and item is an item in this list here. So it can be the number of seconds, the number of minutes, or the number of hours, okay, depending on which iteration we are talking about in this for each loop. But for each item, I will print it out or convert it to a string into a 2-digit decimal number. And that's how I do the string conversion from the number of millisecond to a format that I can actually print on the screen as a label or as text inside the text box. I just spent the last, half hour to explain how to do something that is simple. You give me the number of milliseconds, I display that as hour, minute, second. Well, that's programming, right? I mean, this is programming. You basically look at what is available to you, and then you have to decide, okay, given what App Inventor can do or what a particular programming language can do, how can I get it to do something that I need to do? Well, if it is not there, if it's missing, then you have to implement it. Are there any questions at this point about what I have just explained? I can make this public. In other words, I can publish this in the gallery. So if you need to use a similar logic in your program, you're more than welcome to borrow this kind of code. Okay. Does anyone want me to put this into the gallery? No. We know how to do that.
It's available in the notes. It's available in the notes.
It's available in the video, yes. One thing that is sorely missing in App Inventor is the ability to copy and paste across screens and across projects. That would be nice. Or just have the concept of a library. That would be nice too.
But you can sort of do that by going through the download the source and go through the blocks. Take that, make sure the file names exist, and surgically transport it.
Yeah, you could do that.
Probably paste the same thing, though.
Huh?
If you're using multiple blocks, similar blocks, you can just copy and paste.
But you can only copy and paste within the same screen. You cannot even do it across screens of the same app. So it would be nice if we can do that sort of thing. The only thing it has to do is to make sure that the name of the procedure is not duplicate, and it does not refer to global variables, or the global variable it refers to is already existing in the other context. So those are things that would be nice to have. All right, let's go back to the app, and once again run it a little bit, and I'll explain the other parts too. Okay, so I'm starting the timer, I'm stopping it, I'm starting it again, and I'm stopping it, and I'm starting it again, and I'm stopping it. You can see it continues. It's basically kind of like a stopwatch or a timer where you can press a button to start and stop the timer. So how is that being done? I mean, how do we deal with first of all, how do we deal with the update on the screen? How does remaining gets updated approximately every second or so? So let's switch back to the app and find out how that is done. Okay, we go back to the designer. There's nothing here that you can see that will explain that, because whatever is doing that is under here. It is the clock component that is doing it. The clock component in this case is always firing. The timer is always firing, and it is enabled to begin with. And the timer interval is exactly 1 second, because it's 1,000 milliseconds. 1,000 milliseconds is exactly 1 second. So that means I have the event, or the timer event from clock 1 that is clicking exactly 1 second per, exactly once per second. Okay, I shouldn't say exactly, because it is actually not exactly once per second. It's just whenever it feels like doing it, which is approximately 1 second. But that means, I have a problem, right? Because if I rely on only that to count the number of seconds, then my kids will compare that to the actual stopwatch and say, but Dad, your app is stealing time from my gaming because it is not counting time correctly. Because if the clock runs a little bit faster, then I'll be robbing my kids of their time, for gaming. I don't want that to happen. And I don't want my app to be running too slow, and it ends up giving my kids more time to play games, right? So what am I going to do to fix this problem?
Look at the clock every time you
Exactly. Okay, so let's go back to the blocks here and find out exactly what do I do for each timer event. So let's see here. There we go. You can see that this block is rather complicated. Okay, so this is the code here. Okay, I'm just highlighting the part where I'm talking about. This is the block that is triggered every time I have a timer event. In other words, this code executes about every second, but not exactly every second. So the first thing it would do is a conditional statement. Wow, it starts off with a conditional statement. What is the point? Well, what it is doing is actually testing and say, is the timer actually running? Well, instead of using a separate flag to indicate whether the timer is running or not, I'm using the state of the button to indicate whether the timer is running or not. Because when the timer is running, the label on the button should say stop, and it should be red. And that's what I'm doing here, is to see whether the button itself is saying stop. If the button is saying start, that means the timer is already off, and I'm not going to do anything, with a timer event. On the other hand, if it is running, then this part, this condition should be true, and only in that case I will continue with the content of this conditional statement. Yep.
You normally would want to avoid that if you're doing more than one language.
Say again?
If you have your app in multiple languages, then stop is no longer just stop. It's whatever.
That's why it's comparing to the string constant, because you would change the string constant itself to become the language dependent stuff.
But normally constants are just constants and aren't updated.
Right. So when you install the language pack, you have to basically import all the stuff into the string constants to get it to work. But having a separate flag, yes, it is more independent and it is a safer way to do it. But at this point, I'm just going to use it for this purpose. So it has a few local variables to initialize, and you can see most of these are things that I have stored into the lp-config list of pairs. So it's getting stuff from the list of pairs, over here and over here. The only local variable that is not coming from the list of pair is now, which is using the clock, and that's the representation of the current time using the clock 1 component. So that's the only one that is not coming from the list. Everything else is coming from the list. It's just easier to process once it is in a local variable instead of something in the list. All right, so getting that one done, we now move into the inner block here. I need 2 blocks because this block requires the use of variables initialized by the previous block. So that's why I cannot put this item into the previous block, because the order within the block to initialize local variables apparently is not determined. There's no specific order, so I have to refer to this in the second block to make sure that I initialize the local variable used only after I initialize start and now. And then inside here we have the actual action, which is to set this remaining number of milliseconds in the session to whatever was remaining before this click, before this event, minus the amount of time that is used from the previous time this event happened to the current time this event happens. So it's doing the subtraction and say, okay, this many milliseconds are used up between those 2 events. And I'm going to do the same thing to daily remaining. Okay, so both the session remaining time and the daily remaining time will get decremented by that number of milliseconds. So that means internal to the program, I'm actually using milliseconds to keep track of time. I'm not using just number of seconds. I'm using milliseconds to keep track of time. And what this statement is saying is, if the number of milliseconds remaining in this session is greater than 0, which means there's still time left within this session, it's going to first update the text of the of the 2 labels, how much time is remaining, and it is also going to store everything back into the list. So what do I mean by storing everything back into the list? How much time is remaining in the session? How much time is remaining in for that particular day? You can see that also I'm using true for overwrite, which means those entries should already exist in the list of pairs. Go ahead and overwrite those entries because I need to update those particular entries. And then the last one that is updating is the last start time of the event, because I'm measuring time between the events, so that's why I have to make sure that I keep track of that as well. If the condition is false, which means there's no time left, I'm going to call stop timer, which is another subroutine to handle what I need to do to stop the timer, because we just ran out of time for this particular session. So are there any questions about this particular subroutine, how it actually keeps track of time? So using this method, it becomes completely insensitive to the actual frequency of the timer. In other words, what I can do is now I can go back to designer, change this timer interval to some really odd numbers like 671. It will still work because it's actually just measuring the number of milliseconds between the events and not actually using it's not using the number of event as a timing base. It's using the actual amount of milliseconds between the events to keep track of time. Okay, are there any questions about this app up to this point? No? How much time do you think it took me to write the app up to this point? From scratch, from nothing?
2 hours.
2 hours? Any other numbers?
For you.
Yep. I like that response.
10 hours.
10 hours. Okay, someone just updated his estimate.
I would say less than an
Up to this point, let me see. I started at about, I would say about 9 o'clock or so, and by the time I decided, okay, this is all that I want to do for that night, it was about 1 a.m. So about 4 hours or so, because I actually went back and forth a little bit. You can see that there are subroutines that were written, and then later on I decided, oh, okay, this is not what I want. I'm going to do something else to do it more generally. So it took me about 4 hours to get to this point, which was probably about the right usual speed that I write programs of this type of complexity. And how much time of those 4 hours do you think I spent to start up the virtual device, to set up ADB, to go to the right folder and stuff like that? About a minute. So about 1 minute out of 240 minutes I spent to actually set up the environment to make debugging this a little bit easier. And so it's an insignificant amount of time to use quote unquote the convoluted tool and method to do the debugging.
Question?
Yep.
Did you just jump right in and start coding, or did you spend some time on analysis and flowcharting and design?
That's a very good question, and the honest answer is I just jumped right in.
Yeah.
Because I knew what the program is for already. It's for my kids to keep track of their game time. So I knew that from the get-go what I want this app to do. It's very clear exactly what it needs to do. But as far as the planning is concerned, writing the pseudocode and whatnot, I just usually do it in my head, which is probably not recommended.
Just wing it.
Just wing it. Some people can do that, and some people, probably can benefit from, pseudocoding or flowcharting. It depends on the person. I think that part depends a lot on the person.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Can this run simultaneously with another app?
Yes, it can. It
One app
depends.
at a time?
It depends on your Android system. If you have an older Android system, you can only run one activity at a time. But in the later ones, yes, you can run multiple apps at the same time, and this one does get updated, quote unquote, in the background. I can show you exactly what I mean by that. Okay, so here we have this app running, so I'm going to use the start button here. So you can see the time is about 14:49 or so. If I long press the home button, I can actually switch to some other task if I had some other task already running. And I can go back to this one, and it's actually running. Yep. But I cannot go to the home button to start another app, and that's a limitation of the app inventor itself, because if I press the home button, oh, actually it does let me go back to home, start the browser maybe. Okay, let's see what happens here, whether my app is actually done for. I think it was the menu button, so I take it back. So I'm gonna open up some other stuff here, just go to a certain web page, and then if I long press the home button, you can see now that both apps are showing up. If I click, game timer, it is still running. In other words, yes, you can run multiple apps at the same time, but it depends on which version of Android you are using. If you're using Android 2.3, I'm pretty sure it cannot multitask like this.
Was it still running though?
Huh?
Was it still running though?
Yeah, it was.
So if you let's cut it off at 13:30.
Okay. Switch to this one. Oh, okay. I just went. We can start something else. We can start another app that I wrote, stuff like that. Long press this button. Go back to the browser. Go do a few things here. Let's zoom in. Let's search. Where's my zoom button?
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's enough time. So go back to game timer. Yep, kept running. But it's a new feature. That feature is not present in the older versions of Android.
Was it still running, or just basing on the just updating because the clock is updated?
It has to be running because my app only measures the time between the timer events. Well, that would have taken care of that too.
Yeah, once an update occurs, it'll look at the clock and see the time difference.
To make that determination, I would need to display a counter, basically to count the number of events, in between. But I'm pretty sure it's still running in the background. It's actually still quote unquote clicking in the background. Yep, but that's a new feature of the newer versions of Android. Version 2.3, which is in the emulator of App Inventor 1, that one does not have the ability to do it. So, any other questions about your writing your apps?
Question.
Yep.
Don't apps die after a certain time if there's no action by the user?
No.
It has to be programmed.
An app does not die without a reason. And the reason for an app to get killed is either the app closing, like in this case, if I press the back button, it will close the app. The app is closing itself. It can be initiated by clicking the menu button. If I click, stop this application, that will also stop the application. You can turn off your Android device. That will also to stop the application, but it does not time out by itself. Okay, if you want your app to time out by itself, you can do that programmatically. In other words, you attach some code to your timer, and then you say, okay, if nothing happens, if the user does not interact, or if I do not detect anything changes, and if I do not detect any changes within 3 minutes, turn itself off or close the application. You can do that, but it doesn't do that automatically.
I know if you switch it off from that process and just leave it, it'll cache it as a background process and may kill it at a later time if it needs extra RAM, I think.
Okay.
That's
so
at
that
least
means
with the newer
so
Android versions.
If I have more applications started up, then the system quote unquote will automatically determine whether to close the app to free up more space.
Yeah, I think it's even after you close the window, it has like the application cache itself, so it instantly comes back up without having to reload it into RAM and stuff.
Oh, okay, I see. But it's not active anymore.
Yeah, I believe so. So you can close it all that, but it's still, if you look at the processes, it's still there.
I see. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. All right. Any other questions?
In this situation, where you close it down and then open it later, is it consuming any energy during that time it's sleeping?
If it is suspended, it's not using any processing time, so therefore it is not contributing to any battery drain during that time.
And the RAM refresh is through the whole module itself, so it doesn't include any extra effort.
Right. Yep. No extra energy drain due to that. Okay. Any other questions? Does anyone have a project that is time-based that requires a timer and do timing? Okay. Is this helping with your app, or you don't need to keep track of time the same
Sort of, it's a different
type of time tracking?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not about displaying time.
Okay. Oh, that's one more thing. Even if you're not displaying time and you still need to refer to the current time, you still need to know how to use the timer. I'm pretty sure you know how to do that already, but I'm just gonna show you the methods from the clock. Okay, when you go to the clock, there's only one call that gives you the current time. Well, there are two, but they are slightly different. One is now. Now is giving you the current time using the current time zone that you have selected or that you have configured on your Android device. So if I use now and I'm using it on my own actual Android device, it will be reporting now in Pacific time. This is the phone's time, and then the other one is the system time, and that one is the internal time, which is always in UTC. It's the universal time. What is the C? It's a French word, so they order things a little bit differently. Convention, I think. So system time is not the same as now. Now is actually the current time using the current time zone. So once you have now, you can try to display now, but now is a huge number because it's the number of milliseconds since 1970, January 1st, midnight. So if you want to display the time, you store that as quote-unquote an instant, and then you can use the other conversion stuff, like you can extract the number of minutes, the minute of the hour, you can extract the month, and so on and so forth. You can also do the conversion, in a very easy way. You can just, get the date and time, and that's one single conversion from an instant. So I'm not sure whether you have to do something like that or you're already doing it, but these are the things that you need to do in order to display the actual time from an instant from the now.
Okay. Looks like I already have one right there that says get milliseconds. The last one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Does the instance have to be a clock property, or could it be a numerical value?
An instant?
Yeah.
An instant is a number that you get from now or system time.
I mean, but could you also specify, give it a number?
I believe so. Yeah, because it really is just a number. So if you know what number you're dealing with, you can just you can just calculate that number.
I just want to. Though I'm probably not going to use it. I'm just thinking, does the types have to match?
Oh, I think it's just a number. It's called an instant, but it is just a number. Yeah, there are other really cool stuff too. I make use of duration, because what duration does is you give it two instants. The first one is a start and the other one is an end, and both of those are instants. In other words, you take the now at one point of time, you take the now at another point of time, and duration can do the subtraction for you and also convert it into number of milliseconds. So it's always going to be a number of milliseconds between two particular instants in time, and that is a really useful feature. I make use of this feature in my app to measure the time between instants. The other stuff that may be helpful is all of these add calls here, because you can just add a day to an instant, so it becomes an instant of the next day, same instant of time, but a day after, an hour after, minutes after, and so on. So these can be useful if you are scheduling for something to happen in the future. Okay, so you can schedule things in the future using these. You can do conversion, using day of month, format to date, format to date time, and so on. You can get the number of milliseconds of this instant, because this is actually in number of milliseconds since 1970, which means the internal clock may or may not be using milliseconds as a measuring unit. It can be using some other units. So you have to do the conversion into milliseconds if you only care about the number of milliseconds. And then
there's a function called make instance from. Scroll up a little bit.
milliseconds.
No.
Oh, you mean that?
Yes, but there was. Yeah, there is.
Oh. And it's from a string basically. So you can basically give it a month, day, year, hour, minute, second format, and it will convert that into an instant.
Okay.
So there are type conversions built into the component. But I find, sometimes, it's kind of tricky to determine, which unit you want to use. Do you want to keep everything in the instant format? Do you want to measure everything in milliseconds or what? I mean, that can be tricky. It depends a lot on the application. Yep.
Could you possibly show me how you would write a delay procedure?
A delay procedure. Okay. A delay procedure, what type of order are we talking about? Because it's different depending on how much of a delay we are dealing with.
Like 500 milliseconds? Like, what do you mean exactly?
Okay. Now, how critical is it for you to hit that exactly of 500
Not
milliseconds?
critical, just it needs to be quick. And I'm just thinking, I've been, it
There's-
seems like it should be simple, but I'm
It's
thinking
not
that as
simple.
well. Okay.
There is no way to do it in there's no way to specify do blah 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 blah, wait 500 milliseconds,
exactly.
then continue to do blah blah blah. There's no way to do that. Unfortunately, there's no way to do it.
There's no way?
No way.
You can keep on running a loop until you reach the end of the 500 milliseconds,
You-
then you continue on.
Are you talking about busy waiting?
Yeah. It's not good, but it should be
It's
possible.
not good. The best way to do it is what we call a state machine. Okay, I can let me start a new project because it's kind of an interesting question. So I'm gonna say let's just call this one state machine because that's a typical model for people to use this type of thing. So the way you do it is okay. So let's say button has let me have a button and a label here. Okay, and I wanted to do something at 1 second, 5 second, and 6 second from the time I click the button. Okay. So ideally speaking, inside block, I want to go to button 1 and say, okay, when button 1 click, then I will say display, change label to something, wait 1 second, and then wait another 4 seconds, and then wait another 1 second. But it doesn't have anything to do that because there's no inline wait implemented in this case. So the way to do it is to attach your code to a clock. So you definitely need the use of a clock here, but you don't want it to always fire, and you want to turn off the enable to begin with, because otherwise it'll be clicking as soon as your application is loaded. Timer interval, you don't have to do anything about it because you can always specify it later on. Okay.
Would that particular activity be unresponsive, and because it's doing linearly, line by line, and it's not
Line by line.
multi-threaded for that?
It becomes
particular
harder
activity?
to read. It becomes really hard to read because of that. Okay, so the way I would do it is to do something like this. I would use one global variable to keep track of the state of the quote-unquote state machine, and you can always initialize that to 0 to mean it's inactive. Okay, so you have to come up with numbers to represent which state is which number, and I would use a procedure, okay, to say update state machine. And in this procedure, it will have a multi-branch conditional statement. So depending on the number of states you have to track, number of stages, you will use if, else if. So in the application that I just talked about, it's inactive, 1 second, 5 second, and 6 seconds. So there will be like multiple cases like that. And then in each case, you will have to compare the state to a number to know where which state you're in. So you will basically put in comparisons all over the place, and basically compare your state to a particular number. So we start with 0, which means we are not active at this point. So you would have to kind of copy and paste this a few times and change the number to 1, 2, and 3 in this case. In other words, what you're doing is I'm emulating a switch statement in most programming languages here. When the state is 0, which means it is inactive, I'm at the beginning, the first thing I want to do is to determine how I want to set up the timer. So now I go to clock 1, and then I can specify, because I want it to fire at exactly 1 second after this, so I would set timer interval to 1000 for 1 second, and then I would also enable it but before I do all of these things, I would also change the state to the next state. So I would do a set state to 1. So this way, the next time I call update state machine, it would go to the second branch, and I would have something similar to this in the code. So I would take these 3 lines of code and basically stash it over here, and then this code will be triggered in click. So what click would do is to force the state value to exactly 0 first, and then call update state machine. I'll just go ahead and finish the whole thing. So this way. So I would change it to 0 to make sure that I'm starting from the beginning of the entire thing. And I would also just go to procedure and call update state machine. But after this, inside the timer, if I go to timer, the click event, the timer event itself, the only thing it needs to do from inside there is just to update the state machine. It would go to the next one. I have to finish up the specification here, but that's the only quote-unquote proper way to do it. It's probably not what you want.
Well, yeah, I think I see. Yeah, I was going about it the wrong way. So cool. Awesome.
Yep. It's you can do other things like what Tristan just suggested.
I was under the assumption that he wanted to do something, but not wait and go to the next item. Just wait there.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Then going to the next line of code. Wait there and go to the next line of code.
Yeah, this is the thing about event driven programming is you need a trigger to do something like, okay, now do blah 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 blah. Yeah, there's no easy way to say just suspend until blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because my app has a lot to do with animation and just going from one image to another image. And
Right.
It doesn't. I don't want it to just instantly go from one image to the next image.
Right.
I want it to wait at least half a second before going to the next one.
Right.
So I think I can figure it out based on what you showed me there.
Yeah, this is the quote-unquote proper way to do it, but a lot of people just use a delay loop. Just put a loop with a lot of delay, do something, do nothing, 2,000 times or something like that. But that would not be the proper way to do it. I mean, you can achieve something similar, but it will be device dependent, because if you have a faster machine, then the delay will be shorter than you intend. And then to fix that problem, early day DOS games actually have approaches like that. So what they do is when you load a game first, it has a calibration process. So it would take the current time using the real-time clock, which is completely independent to the program that you're writing. It will take the timestamp and it will do like a 2,000 or 20,000 iterations, and it will look at the real-time clock again, and it will measure the difference of time with the real-time clock. Then it can calibrate itself and say, oh, so 20,000 iterations in the busy loop is equivalent to, let's say, half a second. So from there on, it can do its own calculation and use the busy loop for timing purposes. And that's why when you try to run some of these older games on a new machine, it would give you a division by 0 error, because the new machines are so fast that in terms of the real-time clock, it has experienced 0 time delta.
Yeah, I remember old DOS game. It's like the 11th hour. I try to get that running on a modern system.
Yeah.
The video would play fine, but once it gets into any non-video element, it would go like zzz, next video.
Yep. That's because it's using a busy loop, and busy loops are inherently sensitive to processing resources. But using this way to do it, you don't have to. You won't run into the same problem. Now, the next question is, but what if you have multiple, let's say 5 images that you have to update and they're all independent? My suggestion is to use 5 different state machines and 5 different timers, each one for each animation. It's not simple because there's really no easy solution to it. But that's how in the embedded system world, this is how we do things in embedded system programming. Yep. That's a good question. I like it. Okay. Any other questions related to your projects? Any particular thing that you're running up against and go like, I don't know how to get past this point. Nothing. All right. If there's nothing left, I'm going to turn off the recorder and I will just